It was a quiet Friday evening. In the city of Pripyat, life was ordinary, familiar, and still. The streets were lined with young trees, just beginning to bloom after the long Ukrainian winter. The sky had turned a soft shade of blue-gray by early evening. There was no wind. Apartment windows were open. The air was cool but pleasant. It smelled faintly of soil and concrete, and in the distance of pine. Children had played outside earlier that day. The parks were full after school hours. Families walked along the riverfront path, pushing strollers, carrying plastic shopping bags. The streets were clean, orderly. People were proud of their city. It had been built from the ground up for the workers of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, modern, efficient, and close-knit. Pripyat was not large, but it was young. Founded in 1970, it was a city of engineers, plant workers, teachers, and nurses. The average age of its 50,000 residents was just under 26. Apartment blocks stood in neat rows, numbered, not named. Most were less than 20 years old. The school buildings were still bright, the hospitals fully staffed. There were restaurants, cafes, a hotel, and even an amusement park that was scheduled to open in May. The Ferris wheel, still unused, stood silent in the central plaza, its metal frame catching the fading light. On April 25th, many families were preparing for the long holiday weekend. May Day celebrations were less than a week away. There would be parades, music, and speeches. Teachers had given lighter homework than usual. Shops had extended their hours. The city's cinema had posted its schedule outside on handwritten boards. In homes, televisions played quietly in the background, state programming mostly. News from Moscow, weather reports, cultural documentaries. Inside the apartments, dinners were simple. Soup, bread, stewed potatoes. Children ate early. Parents cleaned up afterward. Radios played low music in the kitchen. A few buildings had balconies that faced the power station. At night, the red aircraft warning lights blinked faintly on the towers above Reactor number 4. They were not seen as ominous, just part of the skyline. There was no visible separation between the city and the plant. They existed together. Most of the adults worked there, or were married to someone who did. Some were engineers. Some were security staff. Others worked in the administrative offices, cleaning teams, or transportation departments. Even those who didn't work directly at the plant relied on it. It powered the region, paid salaries, gave the city its purpose. That evening, the city quieted early. By 10 p.m., the streets were mostly empty. Lights in the apartment windows flickered off one by one. Families went to bed. The hospitals were calm. Night shifts had taken their positions. The schools were dark. The buses had returned to the depot. And at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, a test was underway inside Reactor number 4. The test had been planned for months. It was a safety procedure, a simulation of what would happen during a power outage. The idea was to see if, in the event of external power loss, the reactor's turbines could continue spinning long enough to bridge the gap before the emergency generators activated. It was a technical process involving timing, coordination, and control. No one involved believed it was dangerous. Inside the control room, the night shift engineers had begun the procedure. They were following a schedule, working through a list of steps. It was late, but no one was panicking. Voices were quiet. The room was clean, lit by overhead fluorescence and the soft glow of the reactor control panels. Operators adjusted gauges. Supervisors watched dials. Most believed it would be uneventful. Back in Pripyat, the night remained calm. In one apartment block, a father read quietly at the kitchen table while his wife slept in the next room. In another, a teenage boy listened to a radio broadcast through headphones, the wire stretched across his pillow. A nurse folded laundry before preparing for her morning shift. A young couple sat on their balcony smoking, sharing a quiet conversation. In the city's maternity ward, 3 infants were asleep, watched by a single midwife in a dimly lit room. The sky above the city was clear. No one had any reason to suspect that beneath the surface of the reactor, deep in the graphite and fuel channels, conditions were changing. Control rods were in motion. Pressure was building. A delay in the test had altered the timing. A series of decisions had been made. Not dramatic ones, just small deviations, routine adjustments. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody sounded alarms. And the city slept. It was the last full night Pripyat would ever know. The control room of Reactor 4 was quiet. It was late, approaching midnight, and the air inside was still and clinical. Overhead fluorescent lights gave the room a pale, neutral glow. Rows of instruments blinked in steady rhythms. Switches, dials, and analog meters lined the panels from wall to wall. The men inside had worked this room many times before. They knew the sounds, the lights, the way the machines spoke without words. The test they were preparing for was not seen as unusual. It had been postponed earlier in the day, delayed by a last-minute need to keep electricity flowing to the grid. That decision came from elsewhere, not from the operators inside the plant. So instead of starting in the afternoon as planned, the test would now run through the night shift. This wasn't ideal. Some of the most experienced personnel had gone home, but the decision had been made to go forward. The goal was simple in concept: simulate a power failure and observe whether the momentum from the reactor's steam turbines could keep the water pumps running for long enough to avoid a total shutdown, a window of less than a minute. The diesel generators, which would start automatically, took too long to reach full power. This gap, if not managed, could mean cooling systems went offline, even for a few seconds. So the test was designed to bridge that gap. What the operators needed to do, step by step, was reduce the reactor's power to a low level, disconnect it from the electrical grid, and observe how long the turbines would continue turning on their own. In theory, everything would remain stable, but the reactor, RBMK 1000, was not forgiving at low power. It had a design flaw not widely understood at the time, even by those who operated it daily. At low output, the reactor became unstable. The flow of water and neutrons didn't behave as expected. Small changes could have large consequences. And that night, with the power lowered well below standard levels, the reactor's behavior began to drift outside familiar lines. The control room operators adjusted settings as needed. They monitored the instruments and recalculated timings. One of the junior engineers, following procedure, inserted control rods to reduce reactivity. When the power dropped too far, to a level lower than the test allowed, they attempted to bring it back up again. This required withdrawing rods and adjusting coolant flow. Each action followed a logic, but taken together, the system was becoming increasingly unstable. Warnings appeared, but not as alarms. Just readings, numbers on dials. They were noted and addressed. In some cases, automatic systems had been disabled temporarily to allow the test to proceed. These overrides were logged, approved, carried out quietly. There was no raised voice, no panic, no sense of immediate danger. The atmosphere remained technical, procedural. By shortly after 1 a.m., the test sequence was moving forward. The operators initiated the simulation, cutting power to the turbine, watching the momentum carry the pumps. The pressure inside the core began to fluctuate. The coolant slowed. Steam increased. Sensors registered changes in flow and temperature. Within seconds, the reactor was no longer operating in a predictable state. At 1:23 a.m., an engineer pressed a button to engage AZ-5, the emergency shutdown system. It was a standard response. The button, once activated, would lower all control rods into the core to halt the reaction. It was a built-in safety system, designed for moments of uncertainty. But in the RBMK design, the graphite tips of the rods could cause a brief spike in reactivity before full insertion. Under normal conditions, this would not be a problem. These were not normal conditions. Within a few seconds of pressing AZ-5, the reactor's power surged sharply. Instrumentation readings spiked, not incrementally, but all at once. Steam pressure rose beyond control. Graphite blocks inside the core overheated. The fuel assemblies fractured. And then the reactor lid, a massive metal structure weighing over 1,000 tons, lifted under the force of the explosion from below. There was a deep internal sound, not a thunderclap, not an eruption, but a low, dense rupture. Dust and graphite were thrown into the air. The floor shook. A A second explosion followed, stronger than the first. Panels flew from walls. The room went dark. Inside the control room, the operators felt the shift as much as they heard it. A vibration ran through the walls and floor. Equipment rattled. Then silence, punctuated by alarms. Some men stood in shock. Others moved instinctively, checking systems, calling out readings. But the displays no longer made sense. Communications were limited. The room smelled suddenly of metal, ozone, and heat. No one inside yet understood what had happened. They didn't know that the reactor core was destroyed, that the graphite was burning, that radioactive material was now rising into the night air, carried by wind across rooftops, across streets, across the edge of Pripyat. They knew only that something had gone very wrong, and that beyond the concrete walls, others would soon begin to notice too. The explosion at Reactor 4 was heard in parts of Pripyat, but not in a way that caused alarm. For many residents, it was just a low thump in the night. A few windows rattled. A dog barked. Some people stirred, then went back to sleep. There had been construction work before, loud testing procedures, rumbling at odd hours. The power plant was always active. It did not seem strange, but a few moments later, people began to notice the sky. From the higher floors of apartment buildings, there was a clear line of sight to the plant. It was less than 3 kilometers from the edge of the city, and from some balconies, people could see a red glow rising where the reactor had stood. Not flickering like firewood, steady, broad, lighting the air in a way that seemed wrong, though no one knew exactly why. People came out to look. They stepped onto balconies, leaned out of windows, spoke softly to each other. A few pointed. Some went outside. Children who couldn't sleep were carried by their parents. From a distance, it looked like the roof was on fire, but it was hard to tell. It wasn't loud. There were no sirens yet. By 1:30 a.m., the first fire brigade had arrived at the plant. The call had been routine. A fire reported at Reactor 4. No mention of an explosion. No warning about radiation. The dispatcher noted it as a structural fire. The firefighters brought hoses, axes, and ladders. No protective gear beyond their uniforms. No respirators, just their regular equipment. They were young, most in their 20s. Some had only been working a few years. The scene at the plant was chaotic. Debris covered the ground outside the building. There was smoke, dust, and steam. One of the first crews reported a metallic taste in their mouths. Another described a sensation of heat coming not from the flames, but from the air itself. Still, they advanced toward the fire without hesitation. Some climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall. They began spraying water toward the exposed reactor. Others attempted to reach the upper levels to stop the fires spreading across adjacent structures. Pieces of glowing graphite, mistaken for burning debris, were picked up and moved by hand. Equipment melted. Boots stuck to the floor. Inside the control room, the operators tried to maintain order. Phone calls were made up the chain of command. Reports were vague. Some claimed the reactor was intact. Others insisted it had been blown apart. Information was incomplete. Instructions conflicted. Outside, the sky continued to change color. In Pripyat, people watched the glow as if it were a strange show. No announcements had been made. There were no broadcasts. No orders to stay inside. Children stood barefoot on balconies in their pajamas. Some residents walked toward the bridge outside the city, the one that offered the clearest view of the plant. They leaned on the railing and watched the fire in silence. A few people took photographs. The air was still cool. There was no wind, but the dust was already spreading, invisible particles rising with the smoke, carried upward into the sky, then falling quietly across rooftops, cars, gardens, and open windows. The fire crews worked through the early hours. Some began to feel ill. One collapsed. Another vomited behind a wall and kept working. Their skin reddened. Their eyes burned. At first they assumed it was exhaustion or heat or smoke, but the symptoms grew worse. Numbness, nausea, confusion. A few began to lose strength in their legs. By 3 a.m., a second wave of emergency workers had arrived. Engineers, plant supervisors, additional fire crews. Some were told to go into the building to assess the core. They walked through smoke-filled corridors. Some of them looked directly into the destroyed reactor hall. The core now opened to the sky. The light inside was unnatural, described by one man as blue, like the air was glowing. Outside, fire trucks lined the access road. Drivers sat with their doors open, unsure where to go. Radio chatter grew tense. Back in the city, the hospitals had begun to fill. Doctors noted a strange combination of symptoms: burns without flame, vomiting without illness, skin reddening without heat. But the word radiation was still not spoken officially. The staff treated the injured as best they could. There was no protocol for radiation poisoning. There were no Geiger counters in the emergency rooms. The authorities had not yet informed the city. The official channels were quiet. At 4 a.m., a few families in Pripyat began to notice the taste in the air. Metallic, bitter. Others mentioned headaches. A few children had nosebleeds. People assumed it was from the smoke or the dust, or perhaps just fatigue from staying up late. By sunrise, the sky above the plant was still glowing. The fire had not stopped. The reactor core continued to burn. And all across the city, life went on. People slept, prepared for their shifts, got ready for school. Unaware that the air they were breathing, the streets they would walk, and the lives they thought they knew had already been changed forever. The fire at Reactor 4 continued through the early morning hours. At the plant, the first crews worked without knowing what had happened. They had been dispatched for a roof fire, a standard call. Their instructions were straightforward: control the flames, protect adjacent structures, prevent the spread. No information had been given about radiation. They wore standard uniforms. No special equipment had been issued. The debris on the roof was hot, but it didn't behave like normal fire. Some of it glowed. Steam rose from surfaces that hadn't burned. The men moved quickly, dragging hoses across the roof, stepping around fragments of metal and graphite. The air felt strange. Several described a burning in the throat. A few began coughing. One noticed a metallic taste in his mouth. At the Pripyat City Hospital, staff began receiving patients from the fire station. Most were young, fit. Some walked in on their own. Others were carried. They showed a mix of symptoms: nausea, vomiting, flushed skin, disorientation. The medical staff treated them for chemical exposure. No one mentioned radiation. There had been no alert. By early morning, the number of patients increased. Some of them had burns, but not from flames. The skin was red and hot to the touch, but the burns had no clear source. Others had trouble standing. Their blood pressure dropped. They were confused. The nurses rinsed their faces with water, applied ointments, kept notes. There were no protective measures. Many of the hospital staff had never encountered radiation illness before. Outside, more fire crews arrived at the plant. New shifts came in from nearby towns. They were not briefed on what had already happened. Some walked directly through areas heavily contaminated with radioactive particles. Others climbed onto the roof, where graphite from the reactor core had landed after the explosion. Most did not recognize it as dangerous. They moved debris by hand, continued spraying water, followed the standard firefighting procedure. Symptoms developed quickly: fatigue, headaches, skin damage. Several firefighters collapsed and were taken to the hospital. A few arrived unconscious. Doctors tried intravenous fluids, oxygen, basic wound care. There were no specialized treatments available. Radiation exposure was not officially acknowledged, though some staff began to suspect it. By late morning, a decision was made to transfer the most severe cases to Moscow. A military aircraft was arranged. The patients were loaded carefully, accompanied by medical staff who had little information about what they were treating. Some were no longer responsive. Others remained alert but in pain. At the same time, the fire at the reactor was still being fought. Crews worked in shifts. Those who had been exposed were sent away, replaced by others with no additional protection. The turbine hall was flooded. Burning material continued to fall from above. Graphite remained scattered across the site. In several locations, firefighters stood close to open-air pathways to the destroyed reactor core. The radiation levels in those areas were extremely high, but they had no instruments to measure it. By the end of the first day, dozens of emergency workers had been exposed. Some would survive with long-term health effects. Others would not. None of them had been told the nature of the hazard. They had responded to a fire, not a nuclear accident. And when symptoms appeared, they had continued working, unaware that the environment itself was causing harm. Their equipment was collected afterward. Boots, jackets, helmets, all contaminated. Many of these items were buried or stored in sealed containers. Some were forgotten in storage rooms or thrown into shallow pits near the site. The plant itself remained active in parts. Other reactors continued operating. Shift changes took place as usual. There was no official declaration of crisis. The first responders were not honored immediately. Their injuries were not publicly explained. But by the end of April, their names would begin to appear in internal reports. Not as heroes, simply as casualties of an event that had not yet been fully understood by them or by the people who sent them there. The morning of April 26th began quietly in Pripyat. It was a Saturday. The air was clear. The streets were dry. Sunlight fell over the rooftops, catching on the windows of apartment blocks. From balconies, there was still a view of the power plant. A few people noticed the smoke, but it looked contained. There was no sound of alarms. No official statement had been made. Nothing felt urgent. Children got ready for school. Some wore their uniforms. Others dressed in casual clothes for weekend activities. Schools operated on partial schedules on Saturdays. Classrooms were open. Teachers arrived on time. Students lined up in courtyards. There were songs, announcements, lessons just like every other week. Shops in the city center opened as usual. A bakery displayed fresh loaves in its front window. Workers from the night shift stopped by to buy milk and bread on their way home. Lines formed at small kiosks selling cigarettes and newspapers. No headlines mentioned the reactor. Local radio stations played music and weather updates. In parks and open courtyards, people walked their dogs. Toddlers played near sandboxes. A group of teenagers gathered near the city's amusement park, which had not yet opened, but was visible through the fence. The Ferris wheel stood still, its seats empty. No one gave it much thought. It was a normal weekend, but there were small things that didn't feel right. Some residents woke up with headaches. A few had nausea. Others mentioned an odd metallic taste in their mouths. At first, most ignored it. They assumed it was fatigue, dehydration, or a lingering cold. In one apartment block, several families noticed black dust on their window sills. They wiped it off. The dust came back later that day. At the city hospital, doctors continued to treat the firefighters who had arrived overnight. A few of the patients were now in critical condition. Nurses reported that their symptoms weren't improving. High fever, vomiting, skin discoloration. The staff began to understand that this was not a standard chemical exposure, but they had received no instructions. No specialists had arrived. Still, the hospital kept admitting patients. By mid-morning, several civilians had come in with similar symptoms: nausea, dizziness, burning eyes. A few had skin irritation. Others felt lightheaded, but couldn't explain why. Doctors noted their vital signs and sent them home with instructions to rest. They weren't sure what else to do. At the plant, the situation had not stabilized. Radiation levels remained high, but no public measurements were shared. Engineers and managers worked to assess the damage. Some were still operating other parts of the station. The remaining 3 reactors were not yet shut down. Official reports continued to describe the event as a fire. The word explosion was used carefully. The word radiation was rarely used at all. Inside the city government, officials held brief meetings. They discussed public messaging, evacuation possibilities, and outside assistance. But they had not been authorized to issue statements. Most were still waiting for guidance from Moscow. The delay created uncertainty. Some city workers continued their regular duties. Others quietly sent their families to relatives in nearby towns. By early afternoon, more residents began noticing the changes. The metallic taste was widespread. Some people had skin irritation. Others developed nosebleeds. A few schoolteachers called parents to report that children were unusually fatigued. But there was no central instruction, no news bulletin, no press release. Life in Pripyat carried on in fragments. In grocery stores, people bought items for the weekend. Markets were open. The buses ran on schedule. A few families visited the riverbank for a walk. Couples took photographs of each other beneath flowering trees. Everything looked the same. The danger wasn't visible. Some workers at the plant had gone home to rest after their shift. They sat in kitchens drinking tea, trying to explain what they had seen. A few described the explosion. One man mentioned that the roof was gone. Another said the core was exposed. Their wives listened quietly. Some cried. Others called friends. But no one had official confirmation. That evening, children watched television. It showed the usual programming: music, cartoons, state news. There were no interruptions. The windows were open. The air moved freely through the rooms. Dust continued to fall, too fine to see, too quiet to detect. Parents put their children to bed without knowing they should be worried. No one had been told to stay inside. No iodine tablets were distributed. No masks. No restrictions. No warnings. By the time the sun set again over Pripyat, the contamination had already reached every corner of the city. It covered playgrounds, rooftops, benches, curtains. It had settled in lungs, in skin, in clothing. It had entered homes. But the streets remained calm, and the people, still uninformed, lived one more day in normalcy, unaware that they had already been exposed to something they could not see, hear, or feel. Something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. By the morning of April 27th, 36 hours had passed since the explosion. In Pripyat, the mood had begun to shift. The air was still clear. The city looked the same, but something had changed. People felt it before they were told anything. More children were sick. More adults complained of headaches and dizziness. Several people had nosebleeds. Nurses, unprompted, began keeping notes. Still, there had been no announcement. The television programs were unchanged. The local radio played music and weather updates. There were no public statements about radiation. No guidance. No alerts. At the hospital, staff were over capacity. Dozens of people had arrived overnight. Most showed similar symptoms: nausea, fever, disorientation. The symptoms had not improved with rest. Some patients had begun to lose hair. Others had developed lesions. Still, official guidance remained limited. The doctors were doing what they could. Many were working without protective gear. They had never been trained for this. Around 9 a.m., military vehicles began to appear on the edges of the city. Trucks, jeeps, and transport buses parked near key intersections. Soldiers in uniforms stepped out in formation. They spoke quietly among themselves. Most wore simple cloth masks. A few carried Geiger counters, clicking softly with each movement. They didn't share their readings with residents. They didn't explain what the machines meant. By 10 a.m., apartment blocks were being visited by officials. Men in plain clothes, some in uniform, accompanied by local party administrators. They went door to door with calm voices and notebooks in hand. They instructed residents to prepare to leave. They said it was temporary, a precaution. People were told to bring identification, clothing for a few days, and nothing more. Food would be provided. Transportation would be arranged. The city would be guarded. Their homes would be safe. They were not told why. At first, many residents didn't believe it was serious. There was no sense of panic. The instructions were too calm, too matter-of-fact. Parents packed small bags. Children brought toys. A few people brought radios or books. Most left valuables behind, assuming they would be back in a day or two. Pets were left in courtyards, on balconies, beside open windows. No one had said to take them. By noon, buses began to arrive in groups. They were standard city models, painted in faded white and yellow, marked with route numbers that no longer applied. The drivers were quiet. Soldiers directed people into lines. Every bus filled quickly. Then another arrived. And another. Hundreds of vehicles lined the roads. There were no sirens. No shouts. The city emptied quietly. Some residents walked to the pickup points on foot. Others waited in lobbies or outside their buildings. Neighbors helped the elderly with steps. Teenagers carried bags for their families. A few people stood near their homes, unsure whether to board or wait. No time frame was given. No maps were shared. Throughout the city, the atmosphere was calm but uncertain. No one was panicking, but no one had clear answers. Military personnel wore protective gear, but not all of them. Some wore full suits. Others only simple masks. Most refused to answer questions. Some didn't know the answers themselves. Orders had come down, but explanations had not. By mid-afternoon, most residents had been loaded onto buses. Officials walked through empty apartments, checking each room. In some cases, keys were collected. In others, doors were left unlocked. The assumption was that families would return soon. Few realized this was the last time they would ever see their homes. The evacuation took just under 4 hours. Pripyat, a city built to support one of the Soviet Union's most advanced nuclear facilities, was now empty. The streets were silent. Lights remained on inside buildings. Laundry hung from balconies. Televisions flickered behind curtains. Dogs barked from behind closed doors. Cats sat on windowsills. Radios continued playing to no one. The buses drove toward nearby villages and towns. Most stopped in designated resettlement areas several kilometers away. Residents were given food, water, and shelter. Some were placed in schools, others in community halls. Their names were recorded. Their temperatures were taken. Some were asked questions, but no one was told how long they would stay. Back in Pripyat, soldiers began sealing off the perimeter. Barricades were erected. Roads were blocked. Monitoring stations were set up at key points. The city was no longer active, but it wasn't yet abandoned. It was in between, recently lived in, recently left behind. That night, the city lights still glowed. Inside the plant, fires continued to smolder. Helicopters flew overhead, dropping sand and boron into the destroyed reactor in an attempt to contain the radiation. No official news had been broadcast to the rest of the country. In Moscow, the event was still being described as a minor incident. For those now displaced, the reality of what had happened was still unclear. There had been no images, no briefings, only buses, only silence, and a sky that looked normal. On the morning of April 28th, more than 2 days after the explosion, an alarm was triggered at the Forsmark Nuclear Power Plant in Sweden. It was not a major event. A worker, arriving for his shift, passed through the radiation monitor at the plant's entrance. The detector sounded. He hadn't been near the reactor yet. He was still in his street clothes. At first, the assumption was a malfunction, but a second reading confirmed it. The man's shoes showed elevated levels of radiation. Additional staff were tested. The same result. Traces of radioactive particles, cesium and iodine, were present on clothing and skin. But there had been no incident inside the plant. Nothing had leaked. No maintenance failure. The readings were coming from outside, from the air. Swedish authorities began taking outdoor measurements. Radiation levels were elevated, even miles from the facility. It wasn't dangerous at that moment, but it was unmistakable. Something had released material into the atmosphere, and it had traveled across the Baltic Sea. The source wasn't Sweden. It wasn't Finland. It wasn't Denmark. The air had come from the southeast. Within hours, Swedish scientists contacted their counterparts in other Nordic countries. Measurements from Norway, Finland, and parts of Germany confirmed the same thing. Low but rising levels of airborne radiation. Not background variation. Not medical waste. It had the profile of a nuclear reactor accident. The only likely origin based on wind patterns was the Western Soviet Union. Sweden contacted the Soviet embassy in Stockholm. There was no immediate reply. At the same time, in Moscow, government officials were beginning to receive pressure. Reports from the Chernobyl site described high radiation, a destroyed reactor hall, and growing medical cases. International radio channels had begun to speculate, but no public statement had been prepared. The Soviet news agency, TASS, issued a short bulletin later that day. It stated that a minor incident had occurred at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, that it was being managed, and that there was no cause for concern. There were no images, no numbers, no timeline. It did not mention an explosion. It did not mention radiation. It did not mention evacuation. In Europe, the statement was received with skepticism. Western media began covering the story in fragments. Footage showed Swedish technicians collecting soil samples and measuring rainwater. Experts appeared on television explaining radioactive isotopes and fallout patterns. Maps were published showing the likely path of the radiation cloud. No one knew how much had been released, but the fact of it was no longer in question. On April 29th, the Soviet Union held its first internal government briefing on the scale of the incident. The information was incomplete. Communications between the plant and central authorities had been slow. Key details had not reached senior officials until well after the explosion. The decision to maintain secrecy had been made early, a standard response in the Soviet system, where perception and order were protected above transparency. Outside the USSR, pressure grew. At the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, requests were made for further data. France, West Germany, and the UK offered assistance. American satellites captured infrared images of the reactor site. They showed visible structural damage and heat signatures consistent with an open core. These images were not released to the public, but they confirmed what scientists already suspected. The accident was serious, and the consequences were ongoing. Inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the air was still unstable. Helicopters continued to drop sand, boron, and clay into the reactor. Workers, known as liquidators, were now arriving in large numbers. They were tasked with cleanup, containment, and assessment. Many had received only basic instructions. Some wore full suits. Others did not. Most were not told how dangerous the conditions really were. In Pripyat, residents now relocated to surrounding towns were still waiting for information. Many assumed they would return home soon. Few had received clear explanations about why they had been evacuated. The word radiation had been spoken privately, but not yet addressed publicly. Official briefings remained vague. On May 1st, May Day parades were held in Moscow, Kiev, and Minsk. The decision to proceed had been made days earlier. Canceling would signal that something had gone wrong. Images of smiling citizens, waving flags, and marching under banners were broadcast on Soviet television. In Kiev, only 130 kilometers south of Chernobyl, children marched in the streets. Flowers were thrown. Speeches were given. No protective measures were taken. The government had not told them anything. In the following days, more countries detected contamination in their air, rain, and soil. Austria, Switzerland, Italy. Readings varied, but the pattern was clear. Fallout had crossed Europe. It would continue to do so for weeks. Crops in some regions were later destroyed. Livestock was tested. Some food shipments were rejected. Airline routes were temporarily adjusted. People asked whether they were safe. Health officials gave measured answers. The Soviet Union issued a second statement, admitting that the accident had caused some damage and that containment work was ongoing. It did not address the scale. It did not acknowledge deaths. It did not name the reactor. Outside observers filled in the blanks. Chernobyl was no longer a secret. But inside the zone and across much of the Soviet population, the full reality was still being withheld. The fire continued to burn. The radiation continued to spread, and the efforts to control both were only just beginning. After the explosion, once the fires had been partially contained and the city evacuated, the Soviet response entered its next phase. Thousands of people were mobilized and sent to the area surrounding the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. They were called liquidators, a term used not officially at first, but among the workers themselves. Their job was not defined by a single task. It was to do what needed to be done. The liquidators included soldiers, firefighters, civil defense personnel, engineers, miners, crane operators, and volunteers. Some were brought in with orders. Others volunteered without knowing what they were walking into. Many were told only that there had been a reactor accident and that their help was necessary to ensure safety and stability. Few were given full information. Fewer still were given the proper equipment. When they arrived near the zone, most were issued basic gear: cotton jumpsuits, rubber boots, paper masks. Some received dosimeters, but they were in short supply. Many teams had only one per group. Some worked without any measurement at all. The radiation was invisible. There was no color, no odor. Unless you had seen the damage firsthand, the danger didn't look like danger. One of the first priorities was clearing radioactive debris from the roof of Reactor 3, which had been littered with pieces of the destroyed reactor core and chunks of highly contaminated graphite. The initial plan was to use remote-controlled vehicles, robotic arms and small bulldozers, to push the debris into the destroyed reactor hull. But the machines failed quickly. The radiation levels interfered with their circuits. Some stopped working within minutes, so the job was assigned to humans. Soldiers were sent onto the roof in short shifts, between 90 seconds and 2 minutes at a time. They were instructed to run across the roof, grab a piece of debris with a shovel or gloved hands, and throw it over the edge into a designated area. They were told not to stop, not to look around, not to rest. Each man completed his task, then returned to the stairwell, and was sent away. Some did this once, others more than once. They were later told how much radiation they had received. For many, it was more than they would have been allowed in a lifetime under normal regulations. Other liquidators were assigned to decontaminate the town of Pripyat. Streets were washed, grass was removed, topsoil was scraped and buried. Entire neighborhoods were sprayed with chemicals in an effort to bind radioactive dust to the ground. The work went on for weeks, but radiation levels remained high. Some buildings were abandoned. Others were marked for future demolition. Still more were sent into the surrounding villages. More than 100,000 people had lived in the wider region around the plant. Most had been evacuated, but some refused to leave. Others had not yet been reached. Liquidators went house to house, explaining the situation as best they could. Many residents were elderly. Some had lived on their land for generations and didn't believe the warnings. Others left quietly, taking only what they could carry. After the evacuations, the liquidators were ordered to remove contaminated materials. Homes were emptied. Furniture was burned. Clothing, books, toys. Anything that couldn't be scrubbed was destroyed. In some places, entire houses were bulldozed and buried under earth. Wells were sealed. Trees were cut down. Livestock was destroyed. Dogs and cats, left behind during the evacuations, were also killed. It was a policy carried out quietly, without public discussion. In the months that followed, more workers arrived. Construction crews began building what would become the sarcophagus, a massive concrete and steel structure designed to enclose the remains of Reactor 4. The work was dangerous. Radiation levels inside the zone fluctuated constantly. Some areas could be accessed for hours. Others were lethal within minutes. Engineers tried to design shielding, but materials and time were limited. Crews worked in rotation. Some were sent home after a few days. Others stayed for weeks. Throughout the operation, secrecy remained in place. The liquidators were not officially recognized for months. Their names were not announced. Their roles were not discussed in newspapers. Many were told not to speak of what they had seen. Some followed that instruction for the rest of their lives. Not all were affected in the same way. Some liquidators remained healthy. Others developed symptoms within months: fatigue, immune problems, unexplained illnesses. Many reported persistent headaches, weakness, memory loss. Medical records were inconsistent. Some were treated, some were not. The long-term effects of exposure varied widely and were not always acknowledged. What united them was the fact that they had shown up. In a system where orders were rarely questioned and information was not freely shared, they responded when called. Some believed they were protecting the nation. Others believed they were cleaning up an accident. A few understood the risk more clearly than the rest. Most only found out later. Official numbers state that more than 600,000 people were involved in the Chernobyl cleanup over the years that followed. They came from across the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, the Baltics, Central Asia. They worked in shifts. They dug trenches. They buried waste. They built structures. They followed instructions. And when their assignments ended, they went home, often to families who had no idea what they had been part of. Some never spoke about it again. Others told their stories later in interviews, in hospital beds, or in letters. But for many, the work was not remembered through photographs or medals. It was remembered through silence, through symptoms, and through the knowledge that they had gone where few others would, into a place most people would never see, to do a job few people understood. In the days after the explosion at Reactor 4, the Soviet government did not rush to release information. On April 28, 3 full days after the accident, the state news agency issued a short statement. It acknowledged that an incident had taken place at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. It said that damage had occurred. It said measures were being taken. There were no details, no names, no dates, no mention of fire, radiation, or death. This was not unusual. The Soviet Union managed disasters differently than many other countries. Public order, social confidence, and institutional stability were prioritized above open disclosure. The idea was simple: minimize disruption, contain panic, protect the system from embarrassment. But the radiation could not be contained. Foreign governments had already begun asking questions. Swedish authorities had raised concerns. German scientists were measuring isotopes in the air. News stations in the West had shown maps, interviewed experts, and speculated on the scale of the accident. The story was out, even if the Soviet public had not yet heard it. Inside the Kremlin, senior officials met in closed sessions. Briefings were compiled by mid-level staff, many of whom were working from limited or outdated information. Chernobyl was far from Moscow, both geographically and politically. Regional administrators had not sent full reports. Communications had broken down in the first hours after the explosion. Some early assessments were vague. Others were heavily filtered. What reached the highest levels of power was already incomplete. Still, the pressure to respond was growing. On May 14th, 18 days after the explosion, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the nation on state television. It was his first public statement about the disaster. He spoke calmly. He reassured viewers that the situation was under control. He expressed concern for those affected. He framed the response as a model of Soviet unity. The speech was broadcast across all channels. Many Soviet citizens heard about Chernobyl in full for the first time that night. Before that, most had learned of the disaster through whispers, foreign radio, or private phone calls from relatives in Ukraine. Even in Kiev, just 130 kilometers away, residents had received little information. May Day parades had continued as planned. Schools had remained open. There had been no immediate protective measures. In many homes, people had simply assumed they would be told if something serious had happened. Behind the scenes, committees had been formed. Investigations were launched to determine the cause of the explosion. Some were technical in nature, focused on the design of the reactor, the test procedure, the systems that had failed. Others were political. They looked at blame, messaging, and control. Internal documents were circulated. Some described safety lapses. Others pointed to human error. A few raised questions about the RBMK reactor itself. The RBMK design had been used across the Soviet Union. Any admission of a systemic flaw would have wide-reaching consequences. Modifications would be expensive. Confidence would drop. Leadership, both political and scientific, would be questioned. There was no appetite for that, so the focus turned to individuals. The plant operators who had been on duty the night of the explosion were placed under investigation. They were accused of violating procedure, of conducting a flawed test, of disregarding warnings. Their behavior, it was said, had caused the explosion. In some cases, this was true. The test had gone wrong. The power levels had dropped too low. Emergency shutdown systems had been disabled. But the design of the reactor, particularly the positive void coefficient and the flawed control rod tips, was not mentioned publicly. Eventually, 3 men were arrested. They were charged with gross violations of safety regulations. Their names were printed in newspapers. Their photographs were shown on television. For many viewers, they became the face of the disaster. Not the reactor, not the system, not the silence, just the men who had pressed the wrong buttons. In the months that followed, international scientists were invited to visit the site. A small group from the International Atomic Energy Agency toured the damaged reactor. They were given guided access. Some questions were answered, others were deferred. The site was still dangerous. Radiation levels were high. The Soviet officials presented the situation as difficult but controlled. They focused on the success of the sarcophagus, the heroism of the workers, and the strength of the national response. The full consequences were not discussed, nor were the health effects among liquidators, nor the contamination of soil, water, and forests across Belarus and Ukraine. Maps remained classified. Data was shared selectively. Photographs were edited. Numbers were debated. Privately, officials acknowledged that large areas would remain unsafe for decades. But publicly, the message remained steady. The crisis had been contained. The damage had been limited. The system had worked. In time, this narrative began to erode, not because of protest or rebellion, but because of lived experience. People in villages near the exclusion zone began to speak about the illness, the relocations, the strange silences from local authorities. Some tried to return home and were stopped. Others did return and found their homes changed, not by fire or flood, but by something invisible. Gardens didn't grow the same way. Animals behaved differently. Water tasted wrong. The story of Chernobyl, as told by the state, remained fixed for years. But the people who lived near it remembered differently. Not with slogans or monuments, but with absence. After the evacuation of Pripyat on April 27th, more than 50,000 people were relocated within a single afternoon. They were told it was temporary, that the buses would bring them to safety, that they should pack light and expect to return within a few days. Most believed that. They left their windows open. They left food on the stove. They locked their doors or didn't. They fed their pets one last time. They wore spring coats. They packed photographs or didn't. Some brought radios. Others forgot medicine. They arrived in nearby towns and villages, Polotsk, Ivankiv, Narodiki, and then later further away. Gymnasiums were turned into dormitories, schools into shelters. They were registered, recorded, and assigned new places to sleep. Meals were distributed from trucks. People waited in lines. Some sat quietly. Others asked questions. No one had answers. Days passed, then weeks. The return never came. Soon, it became clear that the evacuation was permanent. New towns were planned. Housing blocks were built at speed. The largest of these became known as Slavudik, a planned city constructed in record time to rehouse many of the workers and families displaced from Pripyat. It was located further east, outside the worst of the contaminated zones, but still close enough to support ongoing operations at the power plant. Slavudik had the same rectangular apartment blocks, the same wide streets, but something essential was missing. It wasn't that the buildings were worse. It wasn't that the parks were smaller. It was that it wasn't Pripyat. People adjusted because they had to. Children returned to school. Markets opened. Routines were built again. But the memory of their former lives settled quietly behind every door. In Slavudik, families tried to recreate the order of what had been lost. Curtains were hung the same way. Furniture was arranged like before. Some families taped photographs to the walls, not as decoration, but as orientation. But many things didn't transfer. In the new cities and villages, jobs had changed. Some who had worked at the plant no longer did. Others were reassigned to administrative roles, far from the exclusion zone. A few returned to work, commuting through military checkpoints, dressed in protective suits, crossing into the silence where they used to live. Children asked questions that parents weren't ready to answer. Teachers avoided the subject. In most official spaces, the word Chernobyl was mentioned sparingly. The disaster was acknowledged, but not deeply explored. In public, it was framed as an accident, regrettable but past. In private, it lingered in different ways. Medical issues began to surface. Some were immediate. Others developed slowly. Fatigue, Skin problems, immune disorders. In Belarus and northern Ukraine, doctors began to see patterns. Thyroid cancer appeared in children at rates higher than expected. Researchers asked for long-term studies. In some cases, permission was given. In others, denied. People adapted. Some grew silent. Others became more vocal. Small support groups formed. Families compared notes. Many of them had lost relatives, not from the explosion itself, but from the years that followed. In some resettled communities, people tried to forget. Others returned, illegally, to the places they had left. The Samozaselyency, or self-settlers, were mostly older residents who refused to stay away. They came back to their homes in the exclusion zone, grew vegetables, raised animals, and lived without electricity or water systems. They accepted the risks. For them, life elsewhere had felt more foreign than the threat of radiation. The state did not support their return, but mostly left them alone. Over time, the abandoned villages returned to nature. Roofs collapsed. Trees grew through walls. Roads cracked. Wildlife increased. The silence deepened. But in small homes behind locked gates, some people continued to live as they always had, planting, boiling water, listening to radio static. The people who had left Pripyat remained dispersed. Many never visited the city again. Others returned once, years later, as part of supervised tours. They found their old apartments with keys that still worked. The furniture was where they had left it. The wallpaper had peeled. Mold covered the windows. Some rooms still had books, shoes, toys. Some residents walked through their homes in silence. Others took photographs. A few collected small items and put them in their pockets, not for use, but to carry something back. After that, they returned to Slavudik or Kiev or wherever life had taken them. There were no reunions in the traditional sense. The community had been dispersed, not only physically, but emotionally. The shared experience had been broken by time, distance, and silence. Everyone had adapted differently. Some refused to talk about it. Others kept records, wrote journals, gave interviews. But few ever stopped thinking about the day they left and didn't go back. The homes they lost were not destroyed by fire or flood. They were not consumed all at once. They were left intact in structure, but changed in meaning, by dust, by time, and by a kind of stillness that remained long after the people were gone. Chernobyl was never officially buried. It was enclosed, contained, sealed off behind checkpoints and warning signs. But it didn't vanish. It remained present in many ways, in the medical histories of thousands, in the policy shifts that followed slowly, and in the quiet inheritance passed down from one generation to the next. For many who had lived through it, the memory was not something spoken about often. It stayed in the background, not suppressed, but reserved. It came up in fragments, in a story told to a child, in a correction made when a detail was misunderstood, in the brief pause before answering the question. Where are you from? Young people who had been children at the time of the evacuation grew up with gaps in their early years. Some remembered the bus rides. Some remembered the heat. Others remembered a pet left behind, a teacher who stopped returning to class, or the strange color of the sky that morning. But they often didn't have a single clear story, just small pieces. Many of them now have children of their own. The word Chernobyl no longer exists only as a place or a disaster. It has become a reference point, a symbol of warning, of failure, of resilience. It appears in school books. It is shown in documentaries. It is visited by tourists. But the experience itself was not something that can be fully reassembled. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, the long-term medical consequences of the disaster have remained a subject of study and also of dispute. Some government figures list a relatively small number of confirmed deaths, mostly among plant workers and early responders. Others point to broader health trends: increased cancers, chronic illnesses, birth defects. Not all of these can be directly traced, but for many families, the connection feels certain. They watched it unfold, not in statistics, but in hospital visits, medication routines, and empty chairs. The exclusion zone remains closed to permanent settlement. It covers over 2,600 square kilometers of northern Ukraine. Inside the zone, nature has reclaimed most of what was abandoned. Trees grow through buildings. Animals roam freely. Wolves, bears, wild horses. In places where humans have not returned, the forest has crept inward. But the radiation has not disappeared. It exists in uneven layers. It rests in soil, in moss, in the shells of buildings. Some areas are relatively stable. Others remain dangerous. Scientists monitor levels. Researchers conduct studies. Military patrols keep watch. Tour groups are allowed to enter with guides on designated paths for limited hours. They wear dosimeters. They follow strict routes. Visitors take photographs of rusted playgrounds, empty classrooms, and sun-bleached furniture. But what they see is not the event, only the absence that followed. The city of Pripyat is still there. It has not been destroyed. It was left, then frozen by time. Its streets still carry the layout of a functioning city. Street signs remain. Bus stops are visible. The Ferris wheel stands motionless. But every surface has changed, not just physically, but in meaning. It is not just a place where people lived. It is a reminder of how quickly life can end without warning and without sound. In Ukraine, especially after independence, Chernobyl became a more open topic. Memorials were built. Books were published. Survivors were interviewed. In some cities, ceremonies are held every year on April 26th. Bells are rung. Names are read aloud. Candles are lit. The tone is not one of protest or blame, but of memory, of respect, and of the quiet acknowledgement that this was not just a technical failure, it was a human one. Educational institutions began to include more honest accounts. Universities studied the chain of decisions that led to the disaster. Engineers trained differently. Some of the old designs were phased out. Some remained. Not all changes came quickly. Not all were consistent. But the awareness had shifted. In popular culture, Chernobyl became known far beyond Eastern Europe. The name was used in novels, in television, in music. In some cases, the treatment was respectful. In others, simplified. The details were often adjusted for drama, for narrative clarity, for impact. But behind each interpretation was a reality that remained unchanged. A reactor core destroyed, a city emptied, a landscape altered, and lives that continued despite all of it. The men and women who responded in the first hours are remembered differently now than they were then. Some were honored formally, others were not. Many died without recognition. Their names exist in local records, on gravestones, or in quiet stories told within families. Their uniforms were burned. Their equipment was buried. But the fact of what they faced remains. They were the first to see something no one understood. They were told to go in, and they did, not out of heroism as a gesture, but because they were called and they went. In every country, some events pass into memory and stay there. Others become layered, lived, recorded, retold, and reshaped. Chernobyl became something more than a disaster. It became a long, slow unfolding. It became a silence that lasted years. It became a shape cast over lives, not in one day, but in every day that followed. And for those who were there, or nearby, or connected in ways that didn't make headlines, that shadow is still part of their story, even if they don't always speak it aloud. The exclusion zone is quiet now. 30 kilometers of empty space surround what used to be a city. Roads crack beneath moss and roots. Street lamps stand tilted. In the windows of Pripyat's apartments, the curtains are still there, faded and hanging where no one has touched them. Inside some homes, wallpaper has peeled in long sheets. Dust settles on schoolbooks and calendars that stopped in 1986. Nothing moves quickly here. The reactor itself is no longer visible in its original form. The sarcophagus built in the months after the disaster was never meant to last. It held, but not permanently. Decades later, it was enclosed again, this time with a vast steel structure, curved and silver, designed to seal the remains of Reactor 4 for another century. It's called the New Safe Confinement. It spans over 100 meters high, taller than most cathedrals, but few come close enough to see it in person. Around it, sensors continue to monitor radiation. Crews still work in shifts, maintaining the barriers, checking stability, recording the slow decay. The reactor is no longer active, but the process of managing what it left behind continues. It's a task not for days or years, but for lifetimes. The material inside, graphite, uranium, debris, remains dangerous. There are no longer large numbers of people living inside the zone. A few elderly residents stayed or came back quietly. They live in cottages with wood stoves, surrounded by the silence of forests that were once villages. They grow vegetables, keep chickens, draw water from wells. Some have radios. Others don't. They are left mostly alone. Tourists visit during the warmer months. They come in small groups with guides and permission slips. They take photographs of rusting buses and empty hospitals. They stand under the Ferris wheel in the city center, imagining what it would have looked like full of children. Some ask questions. Others walk silently. What they see is not destruction. It's the absence of continuation. Outside the zone, the name Chernobyl remains tied to more than geography. It's used as a lesson in risk, in oversight, in system failure. But for those who remember the people, not just the event, it's something else. A city where people lived, where schools were open, where hospital staff did their work, where workers followed instructions until the instructions stopped making sense. The impact of Chernobyl didn't move like a wave. It unfolded in layers. The explosion was brief, but the consequences arrived slowly. They appeared in health records, in policy changes, in the quiet spread of knowledge that what had happened was larger than anyone first admitted. There were no final announcements. There was no moment when it was declared over. Just the steady movement of people away from their homes. The gradual acceptance that they would not return. The slow growth of plants where playgrounds had been. The long silence of a place that once ran on schedules, announcements, and steam. And yet, not all of it faded. Some survivors became advocates. Some worked in nuclear safety. Others raised children who grew up hearing fragments of stories. Not about explosions, but about the day the city was left behind. These stories didn't ask for recognition. They weren't always shared publicly. They existed in small ways, in how people kept records, or avoided certain questions, or paused before telling someone where they were from. Today, Chernobyl is both a memory and a responsibility. It belongs to no single country and no single field of study. It is technical and human. It is environmental and personal. It's a place on the map and a line in the mind, the point where before and after separated and never fully came back together. The structures may continue to stand. The zone may continue to empty and grow, but the event remains in motion, not as news but as presence. Quiet, ongoing, and carried forward by those who lived through it, and by those who came after, walking through the stillness with careful steps.